Yes, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks for being here today, for giving me a few minutes of your time. I'm Deniz Kuypers. As Hayo said, I'm in San Francisco, and the book I want to tell you about is called The Atlas of Everywhere. It's a book about my father, but it's also a book about my role as a father. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. It's a book about migration, about the things we take with us when we leave our home, our native country. It asks the question of whether we can actually really ever find our home in the world once we've left our native country behind and our family. But it's also a book about coming home, about the stories that connect us to a place and to its histories, and also to each other. And I think in these times of global crises, I think it's a relevant topic. Um, the book for me started in October of 2017 in Ireland on Heartbreak Pier, the last stop of the Titanic before its Atlantic crossing. I was there with my wife. It was our first vacation since the kids were born, and I was overwhelmed by this sense of freedom. There was light, there was air, there was room for thought. Because besides all the beautiful things that parenthood had brought out in me, I've been struggling with anger and frustration and impatience, and it got so bad that my wife said she was afraid I was going to leave her, and of course, this terrified me. So I wanted to find out where these feelings came from. And I was standing there on Heartbreak Pier, and I was thinking about my great grandfather who had also been unhappy and restless, and he'd wanted to leave the Netherlands and go to America and start a business. And once the business was profitable, he would bring over my great grandmother. But the boat he took was the Titanic. And so I never got to meet him. And so I started thinking about my dad as the source of my restlessness and all my negative feelings toward parenthood, because he came to the Netherlands from Turkey in the 1960s. And he worked in a factory, he welded car parts, he glued radio antennae, he barely spoke any Dutch. And he also was angry and he was frustrated because the life he had imagined for himself had not worked out the way he'd wanted to. He'd grown up on a farm, a small farm in the northeast of Turkey, with goats and hazelnut trees and people who could barely read or write. But he wanted to learn, and he did. He went to the big city. He met a girl. He fell in love. He got a job at a newspaper, and all of a sudden, this whole new life was within within reach. He was going to be a poet. He was going to be a professor. But then something happened. He ended up in prison for murder. He lost his girl. He, a few years later, went back to the farm. He could not connect with his old life, couldn't find a job, and so he went to the Netherlands. He met my mom, and soon after, my sister and then I was born. And all of a sudden, he had two lives. He had his life in Turkey, and he had his life in the Netherlands, and neither of which made him happy. And we felt this unhappiness, my sister and I. But it was not his hands necessarily that hurt the most. It was his disappointment, because he was disappointed in life and his family, but mostly in me, his only son. And so 20 years later, I was afraid the same thing was going to happen to me. I'd fled all the way to the west coast of the United States. I'd not talked to him in 20 years. I'd not even thought of him in 20 years. And all of a sudden, I found him deep inside myself. And I, I realized that the only way for me to really let go of him was to embrace him. But I knew so little about him because I speak no Turkish and he speaks no Dutch. And so all the years that we lived together, we barely communicated. So I called my mom to ask for stories about the past, and she got upset because she didn't want me to write about him. She was afraid of what I would write about him. And then I called my sister and found out that her stories of the past were completely different from mine. And so that's how I ended up with the form the book took, because it ended up being not a book about my dad, but about the dad that he was for me. And so it's not a biography. It's not a biography of him or of me, but of the people that I think we are or could have been. And so, I hope you'll be just as excited about the book as I am. And obviously, when the time is right, I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you for your time.